Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Chris Shepard, who is Artistic Director of Worcester Chorus, and will be conducting Worcester Chorus and the Worcester Children's Chorus and a bevy of soloists and divas on Saturday evening, May 18th at Mechanics Hall, and Lisa Dutton-Swain will speak to you about that at the break. So Dr. Shepard has been, this is his completing his fourth year of conducting Worcester Chorus. We've been thrilled to have him. And he worked 10 years in Australia and leading boys high school and the Sydney and Bach Choir, which he founded. And then 4 years ago he came back to the States because he just missed New England so much. And he's been conducting us, and now he also directs the Bethel choirs in New York City and St. John's Episcopal Church in Stamford, Connecticut. Wow. And we're thrilled to have him here today, so welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm so glad to be back, and I must say I'm touched that I see so many familiar faces from last time. Because when you walk in, you always think, oh God, everybody was here before. If they don't come back, I think I might as well just give up. For those of you who were here before, I'm going to swap the proportion of what I did last time. Last time I talked a lot and played a little music. Today's the other way around. And let me apologize in advance. You will leave with an earworm because you are going to hear the famous habanera about 8 times, not in its entirety, but you're going to be sick of it by the end. And I also want to begin with an apology. I was saying to Patsy, I've been, for the last 2 years, have very much enjoyed being the interim choir director at Holy Cross College. And we just finished our last concert, but because I came to the end of that commitment, I suddenly I can tell that I'm a New Englander because I feel guilty if I ever have a day off. So because I came to the end of my working commitments, I said yes to all these different invitations for the next few weeks. So I actually have to leave by 1 o'clock to go work with a bunch of middle school kids in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. So I apologize. But I particularly apologize to Rick Kimball, who I really wanted to hear talk. Rick is actually the opera buff, the opera expert, not I, and I do confess that in the beginning. And when Patsy invited me to come back, I was first a little nervous because I thought, you know, it's a little out of my, as everybody says these days, out of my wheelhouse. I love opera, but I don't pretend to be an expert. So I thought, what can I bring that I really feel like I can speak with any kind of expertise about? And so I thought, well, I would like to talk to you about the singers who have sung the role of Carmen, because I do a lot of work with singers and I think I know a little bit about the voice. Carmen is a really interesting role because, of course, it is possibly, sorry, this is a PG, this is not a G-rated lecture, this is a PG lecture. It is possibly the sexiest of all the roles. And so although it is a mezzo-soprano role, officially, there have been a number of sopranos who couldn't resist keeping their paws off it. Now, I have a real affection. We have some of my altos are here in the room today, and they know that I have a particular affection for altos, and I have a real affinity for the mezzo-soprano voice. And I feel really bad for these women because they've had to suffer the indignity in recent years of being supplanted by countertenors. So all the Baroque, Renaissance Baroque, and now they're even creeping up into the classical repertoire. Like it's not enough that there are so few mezzo roles, that the men have to steal them. And then, of course, you have Carmen, which sopranos have been stealing. So I just wanted to now I've got to be careful how I pronounce this word because I do say that it's a PG-rated lecture, but it is not an R-rated lecture. So the word that you need to take away today is F-A-C-H. It's a German word, which is pronounced Fach. And it basically means the classification. When singers meet, all of you who have your lingo, people who work in business, you have your banking lingo, and we have our own lingo. And so when I am talking to a singer whom I would like to hire to sing with the Worcester Chorus, for example, you always say at some point in the conversation, what is your fuck? Basically, it's like, what are the roles that sit really well in your voice? And I'll just give you a little sort of background information about conductors. It is our responsibility, I feel very strongly about this, never to put a singer in a position where he or she is not going to be at their very best. And the reason is you never know who's in the audience. Like, I've hired singers, no kidding, singers whom you have heard and have thought, oh my God, they're wonderful. I've hired somebody because they sang the Gounod Ave Maria at their cousin's wedding. You never know where you're going to hear a great singer, and so you want them always to be at their best. So, for example, Krista River, who I've cheated. I try to rotate people through every sort of 3 or 4 years, not hire them too often, but you fall in love with a few voices. And I just have fallen in love with Krista's voice. She is a mezzo-soprano, but it's a very beautiful instrument. It's quite velvety, but has what we in the business call a ping to her sound that sort of cuts through. And she's also, forgive me for saying this, she's not an attorney general, but I can say that. She's also very beautiful. And I think that with Carmen, I think you kind of have to be. I think that you do want to believe that this is a Carmen who is going to have great sex appeal. And Rick he's going to talk much more about the story and its background. But what I will say about Carmen's is that there are a number of different approaches and different people, I'll talk about them. But, you know, Carmen is not, PG, excuse me, Carmen is not a prostitute. But she is a woman who uses her sexuality to her advantage. And that's a really fine line to play dramatically. I'll talk a little bit about how different singers have dealt with that. So this idea of fach and where your voice sits. Most sopranos that you hear, certainly most sopranos that we hire for something like Messiah or Mozart, they are just your regular garden variety, excuse me, sopranos, your garden variety lyric soprano. It is the most common classification. And by the way, you can be a lyric soprano and have quite a big voice, but it's just refers to the fact that it sits, bless you, in the most, when you hear Mimi from La Boheme, for example, that tends to be your classic lyric soprano, very beautiful. The voice type that I really like is the dramatic soprano, and that is your Brünnhilde from Wagner, and those are big voices. They're what I often refer to them as large bore voices. The interesting thing is, you may not necessarily hear it at that. This idea of fach and classification is complicated, because one of the things that makes a dramatic soprano is their ability to cut through an orchestra. And they don't necessarily sound bigger than a large dramatic soprano. But if you would know that you were hearing them by the large size of the orchestra, it just rings right over the top. Wagner and Verdi are your typical composers to hear dramatic sopranos. Now, there is a classification in between, and this is why conductors ask singers what their fach is, because you can't always hear this. And they're called the spintos. And spinto literally means pushed. And they are a lyric soprano that sings a bit bigger, has a little bit more of that ping to their voice. And this is the interesting thing. If you are a spinto, and you're going to hear them, we'll talk about them, a spinto or a dramatic soprano, you can sing Carmen. What makes a mezzo-soprano isn't that they can't sing really high. It's that the sound of their voice in that lower range tends to be a little more velvety. But interestingly, a dramatic soprano, because of the size of her voice, often also sounds velvety in there. I think we all have our favorites, right? I think Jessie Norman is my favorite soprano, partly because she's one of everything. It's really quite an extraordinary voice. When she sings low, you'd swear that she's a mezzo. And you're going to hear a couple of recordings of her, when she sings high, you would never think that she's a mezzo. She's actually a spinto, that she can sort of push past that lyric with a hint of dramatic to her as well. I'll just say one more thing. Complicating all of this is there is a classification of the dramatic mezzo. They're a little rarer, and they are huge voices. You've heard a couple under my direction without necessarily knowing it, because I like to hire dramatic mezzos to sing. For example, we had Elizabeth Russo, the alto, this past December for Messiah. She is actually a dramatic mezzo. She sings Wagner roles. And the reason I like to use them is because the alto part in Messiah is very low. And in Mechanics Hall, it's actually quite hard to sing right to the back. If you use a classic mezzo, reviewers will often say, lovely voice, a little small for that hall. So it's interesting, but they don't begin to sound huge until they sing a bit higher. Okay, so that's just the background on Bach. Let's go back to 1905. This is the first recording that we have of anything from Carmen, and this is a singer called Emi Destin. She's Czech-born. She's a spinto, so that is that voice in between lyric and dramatic. Oh, sorry, I should mention one other classification because you just heard a wonderful example of one, and that is the coloratura. And when you heard Darlene and Dobish sing in the Mozart concert, you would know which one she was because she was the soprano who was there. And they have very high voices, but the coloratura refers to the agility of the instrument. To complicate things even further, you can have dramatic coloraturas. And they're really interesting because they have these huge voices, but despite the hugeness of the instrument, they actually have the agility. A good example, now I don't, and Rick, correct me if I'm wrong, Joan Sutherland, not fully dramatic, no. but she's a good example of a coloratura who has a big voice. Coloraturas are not necessarily, like Darlene, for example, is a classic coloratura. It is a light voice, and they really pipe. And when they do, the Queen of the Night aria. You can have a Roberta Peters voice, which I really love. That's a small coloratura, and they just pop along. But when you hear a dramatic coloratura do that, it's like every note remains large. In any case, so Emi Destin, she premiered the role of Salome, for example, the Strauss opera Salome. She did some of the lighter Wagner roles, but Verdi suited her better. So it was a big voice, but maybe not the hugest. This is the only example that I have. So this is recorded from 1905, and of course it's a terrible recording, but it's always nice to hear these old recordings. I don't have her singing the habanera. I have her sing the seguidilla, which is also very beautiful, and just with piano. This was the stage of recording where it's very hard to record with an orchestra, so most of these singers recorded with piano. Let's have a little listen. Sorry about the scratch, that's just how they are these days. She sounds like a soprano, doesn't she? Then she Driette. And listen, you singers, listen to where she goes into chest voice. Mezzos tend not to. Now, it's very hard to tell in these early recordings because there's not much tone color to them. What I hear, and we all, it's not an objective word, the word metallic is a word that I think of when I hear spintos. as they go higher. It's this very direct, pointed sound that they get, and you can begin to hear that in her voice. You're going to hear it much more in some others later. So you would never hear that and think that she was a mezzo. That is not a heavy voice at all. But it was a beautiful voice, and she was a successful Carmen. If you went to hear Carmen at the Met, and it's possible somebody in this room did, anytime in the 40s or 50s, or into the early 60s, chances are you heard a singer called Risa Stevens. And she really owned that role. Did anybody ever hear her do that live? Oh, God. But recorded. You guys are very lucky. The amazing thing is, she only died this past March 21st. At the age of 99. So, mezzos are very long-lived, of course. Sopranos, on the other hand, they're like small animals whose hearts flutter too fast and they burn out young. And the word on the streets about Risa Stevens, who I believe had Norwegian heritage, that's what, because she's got an umlaut over the E. Despite having a diva's name, she was really down to earth. She came from the Bronx, and everybody loved working with her. Let me just, if you don't mind, quote from the New York Times obituary from March. In her nearly quarter century with the Met, Miss Stevens was most famous for Bizet's Carmen. She sang the title role 124 times with the company, many of them opposite the distinguished tenor Richard Tucker as Don Jose. Over time, Ms. Stevens forsook the traditional interpretation of Carmen as a saucy temptress, playing her instead as hard, calculating, tough, and one step away from a prostitute, which is very interesting because that you think about this sort of anodyne 1950s, that certainly made an impact. Now let's listen to this. So this is a much more classic mezzo voice. You're going to hear this a lot today. We just make the observation. Mezzos, you don't know that they're mezzo till they go down. Mezzos in the upper range, there are a lot of, like Jesse Norman, for example, you know, a full board soprano in that middle range, they can get some pretty thick sounds. But then when she goes down, you can tell that that's where she lives. God, it's a voice. This was recorded with Fritz Reiner in '52, I think. Sorry. Oh, I didn't write my years. Oh, God, that's terrible. But it's 1952 or 1953. Fritz Reiner and the Met Opera. It does get bigger as she goes up. Oh, there's a nice low note. Just in case you're interested, I don't know how many of you have experience as singers or even care about this sort of thing. Another way to describe Fox is, it has to do with the break in the voice. So can you all just do this sort of say, ha! Go ahead. Ha! Woo! Woo! Now that first voice is called the chest voice, and that second voice is called the head voice. And what makes great singers great is that when you listen to them, you can't hear any differentiation. They learn how to, as we say, negotiate the break which is called the passaggio in Italian, the passageway. Now, the other interesting thing about Fox is that where your voice breaks determines where what classification you're in. For example, if you are fans of Broadway shows, those women take their chest voice up as far as they can. That's called the belt, and it's a very exciting sound. Opera singers never do that. The break for a mezzo-soprano is lower, relatively. So what happens is that low part of their voice becomes really velvety, because they learn how to negotiate that. When sopranos, this is what I always listen for when sopranos sing Carmen, what happens is they sometimes sort of chest voice the lowest notes because they don't have that velvety connection in that part of their range. That can also be really thrilling because it has a sort of animal quality to it, but it's a different way of singing it. Let's give you an example. Victoria de los Angeles, who I think is one of the great singers of all time. She was a lyric soprano. Not even a dramatic, not a spinto, really a lyric soprano. But she was Catalan. So you could say that she brings a certain authenticity to her Carmen. Let me go back. I love my New York Times obituaries. This is from her obit. No, truly, if I could do anything other than be a musician, I would love to write obituaries. You want me to write yours? I can hold it for decades. Go ahead. Speaking in the 1977 interview with the New York Times about Carmen, a mezzo-soprano role that Ms. de los Angeles sang with assurance and distinction, she complained that many interpreters simply do not understand Spanish women. Carmen should be elegant, she said, not crude and vulgar, adding, even the common gypsy women have a pride and reserve. They stay faithful to one man at a time. Depends on how you define at a time. No matter what, that is my Carmen. She, some roles that she was famous for was Mimi in La Boheme, Butterfly in Madame Butterfly, Violetta in Traviata. So she could sing getting towards those spinto roles, and Manon in Manon Lescaut. But the recording that first introduced me to Victoria de los Angeles is the Villa Lobos, his Bachianas Brasileiras, #5. And you hear this and you think, really? Butterfly? Really, Carmen? That's a good example. It sounds like the bottom of how far she can take her head voice. You know, like you wouldn't want to go much further. So what is that voice going to be like with Carmen? Sounds really soprano-y, doesn't it? And that low note, again, had an element of chest voice to it. Sure, I thought you needed a break from the habanera. Too bad. Really soprano-y. hear that hint of chest voice there on the bottom? And that's chest voice. So it's interesting, that's just a very, very different color. Now, these next couple, I look at this, for this next singer I wrote absolutely nothing. There are some singers that need no introduction whatsoever. I'm going to play this recording and see if anybody can call out who it is. Ooh, that's not supposed to be that. This is not from Carmen. Leontyne. Such a voice. So she's a spin, or a big lyric. Verdi Puccini was her father. You really hear that metallic spin. That's so tensile. Now, what she has, though, and we're going to hear Jessie Norman later, whose voice I love, as I said before, is a little bit of a dusky quality as she goes into that lower middle range. Did anybody see Leontyne Price sing live?
Yes.
Oh, God. Last year I had prepared my choir to sing at the St. John the Divine Cathedral New Year's Eve Concert for Peace. And she was there. It was so exciting because she has been bringing up a number of particularly African-American sopranos. She's been mentoring them through, and a bass as well. And they were singing, so she was there. I just sort of wanted to walk by her or something. Not to mention the fact that she broke all those barriers. Imagine how difficult that would have been. And she just did it all with such dignity. But that's a soprano voice. Let's see what she does with Carmen. This is with Carmen in Vienna Phil. You hear that duskiness in that part of her voice? And it's cool. It's almost objective. It's very 1963. Mad Men. And there's that chest voice. So it's got more weight to that voice. That's that spinto quality. I always thought she's a very intelligent singer. And when you, even in just that little excerpt, you can hear she makes her choices really, really carefully. And dramatically, there's almost a gauzy quality to that interpretation.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Could you explain physiologically, if you know, what happens between the chest voice and the head voice? in your vocal cords, and what makes the head voice physiologically?
Oh, wow.
Or maybe I need to ask the doctor.
Such an important, it's such a huge question about the physiology. I think one of the, one of the biggest things is the position of the larynx. To get that dusky sort of quality, that the larynx needs to be really low to fight against what would happen if you didn't change anything on the way up. That's keeping the larynx in the same place. But you have to, we say, elongate the vocal tract. And it's learning how to elongate the tract while still controlling all the musculature so that the vocal folds are vibrating in a certain way. But I would need diagrams to be able to answer the whole question. But that's what's so hard. It is such a complicated set of physiological functions that need to work at the same time. And the other thing is you can't fight nature. That if you are a light soprano and you bring your head voice down, you can't get a great deal of vibration down there by middle C. But that was a great timing to ask that question, Patsy. I will slip you a 5 later, because we now come to the most famous example of a soprano singing Carmen, which is Maria Callas.
Yes. Yes.
And the reason why the question was really well timed. Can I just read to you from an English writer, Henry Fothergill Chorley, and what a great, I'm going to change my last name to Chorley, I think. He wrote this about a singer in the 19th century, a bel canto. I don't even know who it was, it doesn't really matter. But she was called, and they use this classification in what is called the bel canto, which is when Bellini was writing and Donizetti, and it was the beginning of modern vocal technique, which is that dropped larynx and elongated vocal tract. And they had a classification called the unlimited soprano, which basically meant that not only did they have a huge range, but they could sound idiomatically mezzo low and soprano high. And this is what he wrote, and I just find this really fascinating. And this could apply equally to Maria Callas, maybe Jessie Norman as well. There was a portion of the scale which differed from the rest in quality and remained to the last under a veil. This is an expression that we often use to be covered, or a veiled sound, and that's that. You're really going to hear it when we get to Jessie Norman in particular. Out of these uncouth materials, she had to compose her instrument and then give it flexibility. Her studies to acquire execution must have been tremendous, but the volubility and brilliancy, when acquired, gained a character of her own. There were a breadth and expressiveness in her roulades, her trills, an evenness and solidity in her shake, vibrato, which imparted to every passage a significance totally beyond the reach of lighter and more spontaneous singers. The best of her audience were held in thrall without being able to analyze what made up the spell, what produced the effect, as soon as she opened her lips. Wow. And I think that could really apply to Callas. There is a great French expression called the jolie laide, which means the pretty ugly, which doesn't mean pretty ugly. It means usually refers to a woman who is homely, but she has this je ne sais quoi that makes her beautiful. A great example of the jolie laide was Coco Chanel, who's really, let's face it, downright ugly. But she had this way of holding herself. Maria Callas was a jolie laide, and Maria Callas's voice was jolie laide. There are many people who just think it was like a kind of coarse, ugly voice, but she knew so much what to do with it technically, and she was a consummate actress. Was she a dramatic coloratura? That most people go towards that. That was that voice I was talking about that has great agility but also big size. She excelled in the bel canto, in the Bellini and Donizetti period, but also Verdi and Puccini and a little Wagner. And she really wanted to do Carmen. And as, what's his name? The Greek shipping magnate? As Aristotle Onassis learned what Maria Callas wants, Maria Callas gets. So here's an example. This is La Belle di Vendremo, One Fine Day, from Butterfly. Yeah. Sorry. I'm such a man. As soon as I need to do something different, I just can't multitask at all. So forgive me. Okay. So this is a little Puccini. Hear that tensile? It's like you can feel the chords being stretched like a balloon. No real weight in that bottom, particularly. So it made her think she could do Carmen. And of course, you know, recordings are difficult with singers. You can't really tell the size of a voice necessarily from a recording. I've always had a really interesting experience as a conductor. When there's a big voice next to me, sometimes they sound smaller than smaller voices. And the reason is, part of what, particularly with the Wagnerian type and with the Spinto, they sound huge in the hall. And it has to do, it's an acoustical thing, it has to do with which hertzes are ringing. There's something called the singer's formant that makes the overtones above where the orchestra plays ring the loudest. So right next to you, it doesn't sound all that big, but the sound is so laser-like. You go out in the hall, and it is enormous. It's like the sound goes out like that. Callas had a voice like that. I don't think that recordings ever do those voice types justice. Okay, so that's definitely a soprano voice. So let's hear her habanera. I bet it's sexy. Now that's a mezzo quality on the bottom. That is not chested. That's that fail.